The starship Harmony glided silently through the void, a gleaming vessel of peace in a universe too often torn by conflict. Its mission was simple: deliver a human delegation to the war-torn planet of Xyrus 9, where two alien factions had been locked in a bitter struggle for generations. The humans were mediators, diplomats, their purpose to broker a ceasefire and bring stability to a world on the brink. But what they found there would change everything. Imagine stepping onto a planet where the air itself crackles with tension, where the ground trembles not from natural forces but from the weight of oppression. The native population of Xyrus 9, a people caught in the crossfire, lived in fear, their cities reduced to rubble, their voices silenced by the boots of their so-called protectors. The human delegation arrived with open hands and hopeful words, only to witness something far darker than they'd been prepared for. This wasn't just a war between factions. This was a system built on cruelty, a cycle of violence meant to keep the powerless underfoot. And in that moment, the mission shifted. What began as a peacekeeping operation became something else entirely. A spark of defiance, a refusal to stand by while injustice raged. The humans of the Harmony weren't warriors by trade, but they carried something far more dangerous: the unshakable belief that no one should live in chains. And when that belief collided with the harsh reality of Xyrus 9, it ignited a revolution no one saw coming. This is the story of how a simple act of courage can unravel an empire, how the smallest light can pierce the deepest darkness. Stick around, because what unfolds next is a tale of defiance, unity, and the unstoppable force of humanity when it refuses to look away. The landing struts of the Harmony hissed as they touched down on the cracked tarmac of Xyrus 9 capital spaceport. Commander Elias Voss was the first to step out, his boots pressing into the ashen soil that smelled of smoke and scorched metal. The air here hung heavy, thick with the kind of silence that comes from a people too afraid to speak. Flanking the landing pad, rows of armored guards stood rigid, their weapons gleaming under the planet's sickly yellow sun. These weren't peacekeepers. Their posture screamed control, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors that gave nothing away. Then came the whisper, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, if not for the desperation laced in it. A native, their body half hidden behind a crumbling wall, one arm wrapped around a wound that seeped dark liquid. Their eyes locked onto Voss, and the words slipped out like a prayer. "Help us," just that, just enough to make the commander's spine stiffen. No official briefing had mentioned this. No diplomatic communique hinted at the raw terror clinging to the locals. The rest of the delegation hesitated, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but protocol demanded they play their part, at least until they knew the full picture. So they walked, escorted by those silent, armed shadows through streets lined with rubble and hollow-eyed faces. Every step deeper into the capital felt less like diplomacy and more like stepping into the belly of a beast. The humans had come to negotiate peace. What they found was a cage, and the first spark of rebellion flickering in the dark. The official reception hall was all polished stone and cold light, a stage carefully set for diplomacy. Commander Voss forced a polite smile as the Xyrusian overseers droned on about progress, about stability, the same hollow words every oppressor uses to justify chains. Then came the moment that shattered the illusion. A server, their hands trembling slightly, brushed past Voss's shoulder. The contact was brief, deliberate. Something small and cool pressed into his palm. He waited until the speeches ended, until the humans were ushered into their private quarters under the guise of security protocols. Only then did he uncurl his fingers to reveal the stolen treasure, a data crystal, its surface etched with rebel markings. The images that flickered to life above the crystal weren't just proof, they were a scream. Mass graves dug by skeletal hands, labor camps where children hauled ore under the crack of whips, and worst of all, footage of so-called peace accords signed in blood, the ruling caste's emblems stamped over piles of bodies. This wasn't war, this was extermination dressed in bureaucratic language. Voss's fist came down on the table with a quiet, terrible thud. "This is not peace," he growled, the words dripping with fury. Around him, the rest of the delegation stood frozen, their carefully rehearsed scripts crumbling to ash. Every piece of their mission had been a lie. The ceasefire negotiations, a performance to legitimize the slaughter. The human delegation's presence, a propaganda coup, proof that even Earth endorsed this butchery. The realization hit like a starship crashing through atmosphere. They weren't here to mediate. They'd been invited to rubber stamp a genocide. But here's what the overseers hadn't accounted for: humanity's one unforgivable trait. We don't follow orders when those orders reek of evil. The moment that crystal activated, every protocol, every diplomatic restraint burned away. Because some lines can't be crossed, some horrors can't be ignored. And in the silence of that room, with the weight of a planet's suffering pressing down, the humans of the Harmony made a choice that would echo across the stars. They stopped being guests, they became accomplices not to tyranny but to the fire about to consume it. The chamber fell deathly silent when the order came. The ruling magistrate, his gilded robes rustling like dried leaves, pointed a clawed finger toward the humans and demanded their compliance. "Denounce the insurgents," he hissed, "or be branded enemies of the peace." Every eye in the hall turned to Voss, waiting for the scripted words of condemnation. What they got instead was a spark that lit the fuse of revolution. Voss didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his uniform suddenly feeling less like a diplomat's garb and more like armor. His voice, low and steady at first, built into something unshakable. "We came here to broker peace," he said, "but peace built on bones is no peace at all." The magistrate's face twisted in disbelief. No one ever refused them, not in centuries of absolute rule. Then came the words that shattered the illusion of control. "If standing against tyranny makes us enemies, then let the record show we stand with the oppressed." Chaos erupted. Guards lunged forward, their weapons snapping up, but not before Voss's thumb found the hidden switch in his sleeve. A silent pulse shot from his wrist, streaking through the atmosphere toward the Harmony. A single command: awaken. Aboard the ship, systems flickered to life, protocols overridden by the emergency beacon. The humans had just declared war with a sentence, and the ruling caste's response was instant. Hands seized Voss's arms, wrenched him backward, but the damage was done. His words were already spreading through the city like wildfire, whispered from lips to ears in the underground corridors where hope had been all but extinguished. What the magistrates didn't understand, what their kind never did understand, was the power of a moment like this. A declaration isn't just words, it's a line drawn in history, a signal that someone finally refuses to bow. And in the shadows of Xyrus 9, where the oppressed had spent lifetimes learning to breathe under the weight of boots, that signal became a heartbeat. The human's arrest was meant to be the end. Instead, it was the first note of a symphony of defiance, because when the Harmony's engines roared to life overhead, answering the call of its commander, the question hanging in the air wasn't if the rebellion would begin, but how fast it would burn. Lieutenant Marquez didn't wait for permission, she never did. The moment Commander Voss's signal cut out, she was already moving, her fingers flying across the Harmony's console as she rerouted power to the ship's emergency thrusters. Around her, the crew scrambled into action, their training overriding the shock. They all knew the truth now. The mission was over. What came next was something far messier. Kess's voice crackled over the rebel frequencies, sharp as a vibroblade. "Give me coordinates now." The reply came in fragments, whispered through static, a hidden route through the detention sector's blind spots, traced by hands that had spent lifetimes mapping every crack in their oppressors' walls. She memorized it in seconds. The detention facility loomed like a tomb, its walls humming with suppression fields meant to snuff out hope. Kes didn't bother with stealth. She kicked in the auxiliary power conduit, flooding the grid with a surge that sent alarms screaming into the night. Guards turned, their weapons rising too late. Kes's pistol barked twice and two figures crumpled. Move, she snapped, her team fanning out behind her, their boots splashing through puddles of spilled coolant as they stormed the halls. They found Voss in the third sublevel, his face bloodied but his eyes blazing. He didn't ask how they'd gotten in. He didn't need to. "We're not leaving without them," Kes snarled, yanking open the adjacent cells where Zyrisian rebels huddled, their wrists raw from shackles. One, a gaunt woman with eyes like smoldering coals, met Kes's gaze and bared her teeth in something too feral to be a smile. The escape was chaos. Suppression drones buzzed overhead, their stun beams slicing through the air as the humans and their new allies dove into the labyrinth of maintenance tunnels beneath the city. Every corner brought fresh danger patrols, automated turrets, the entire weight of a regime scrambling to crush this spark before it caught fire. Kes didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Above them, the Harmony hovered like a specter, its engines painting the sky with streaks of gold, but the ship wasn't their destination anymore. The real fight was here, in the stinking underbelly of a city that had just watched its oppressors flinch. And as Kes vanished into the shadows, a single phrase echoed through the rebel networks, passed from mouth to ear like a lit fuse: "The humans are with us." Hunted, outnumbered, and armed with nothing but defiance, they ran, not toward safety but deeper into the storm, because sometimes the only way to end a war is to burn it down. The tunnels beneath Zyris 9 capital stank of rust and desperation, the walls slick with condensation from centuries of neglect. Commander Voss moved through the dim glow of bioluminescent fungi, the rebels' makeshift lighting, their footfalls muffled by layers of discarded insulation underfoot. Every shadow seemed to pulse with eyes watching, judging. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, taller than the others, his scales etched with scars that told stories no one dared speak aloud. Terk, the rebel leader, didn't offer a handshake. He didn't smile. His voice was gravel wrapped in velvet, low and deliberate. "You humans," he said, tilting his head as if examining a specimen, "you have no idea what you've started." The weight in those words wasn't just caution, it was the exhaustion of someone who'd seen too many sparks snuffed out before they could catch. Voss didn't blink. He stepped closer, close enough to see the faint tremor in Terk's claws, the way his fingers twitched toward the blade at his belt, not from threat. From habit, a lifetime of sleeping with one eye open leaves marks. "Then show us how to finish it," Voss replied, his own voice stripped of diplomacy now, raw with something hotter. Silence stretched between them, thick enough to choke on. Then Terk laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You don't negotiate with storms," he said, turning to gesture at the rebels crowding the tunnels. "You ride them." The admission hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't just an alliance, it was a surrender to inevitability, to the truth that some chains can only be broken with teeth and nails. The pact was sealed without ceremony. Human tech merged with rebel intel, stolen weapons distributed among hands that had never held anything but shackles. Kes crouched beside a young Zyrisian, showing them how to recalibrate a plasma rifle, her fingers moving deftly over the controls. "Like this," she murmured, and the rebels' pupils dilated not just at the knowledge, but at the unspoken promise behind it. "You're not alone anymore." Terk watched it all with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting for the universe to tilt. He leaned toward Voss, his breath warm against the commander's ear. "They'll call you traitors," he warned, "back on Earth, in the halls where they sip wine and pretend war has rules." Voss's smile was a blade. "Let them." Above them, the city shuddered as the first explosion rocked the magistrate's tower. The revolution had been a whisper. Now it was a scream. The orbital defense grid was the ruling caste's crown jewel, a ring of floating fortresses that had kept rebellions grounded for generations. Tonight, it would become their funeral pyre. Lieutenant Kess crouched in the ruins of an old comms array, her fingers dancing across a stolen command console as human algorithms slithered into the grid's archaic systems. Beside her, Terk held his breath. "They'll detect the intrusion," he muttered. Kess didn't look up. "Let them." Alarms pulsed through the orbital station seconds too late. The security protocols were robust, but they'd been designed to repel brute force attacks, not the surgical precision of human hacking, layers of code unraveling like a noose. The first fortress shuddered as its thrusters misfired, sending it careening into its neighbor in a shower of molten debris. Then the real fireworks began. Kess's thumb hovered over the final command. "Tell your people to look up," she said, and Terk's laughter was a knife dragged across stone. The sky above Xyris 9 erupted. Aboard the Magistrate's flagship, panic spread faster than the fire. Screens flickered with static as the grid status indicators blinked out one by one. "How?" the High Commander roared, his claws tearing into the holographic display. No one answered. The humans had been a nuisance, a diplomatic thorn, not this. Not a force that could blind the heavens in a single stroke. Down in the streets, rebels who had spent lifetimes cowering under the grid's shadow now stood frozen, their faces tilted toward the spectacle above. The explosions painted their scars in shifting gold and violet, and for the first time the night didn't feel like a cage. Kess watched the light dance in Terk's eyes as the last fortress winked out. "Now they'll take us seriously," she said, tossing the console aside. The ruling caste's response would be brutal, predictable, but it didn't matter. The grid was gone, the sky belonged to the rebels now, and somewhere in the chaos a single truth crystallized: the humans hadn't just broken a weapon. They'd shattered the illusion of invincibility. The safe house smelled of burning circuitry and stale rations, the air thick with the tension of a plan about to unravel. Commander Voss knelt beside a flickering holomap, tracing escape routes with a finger, right up until the muzzle of a plasma pistol pressed into the back of his skull. "Don't move," hissed a voice he recognized, Jorel, the scarred rebel who'd fought beside them just hours earlier. Around the room, other Xyrisians raised their weapons, not toward the doors, not toward the enemy outside, but at their human allies. The betrayal hit like a gut punch. Jorel's claws trembled around the trigger. "They offered amnesty," he spat, "for all of us, just you." The words dripped with shame, but his grip didn't waver. Somewhere in the compound, a door slammed, militia boots pounding closer. Voss didn't beg, didn't bargain. He lunged sideways as Kess's shot seared past his ear, taking Jorel's pistol handoff at the wrist. Chaos erupted. Rebels turned on rebels, blades flashing in the half-light as the Alliance shattered like glass. They barely made it to the sewers. Bullets turned the filthy water to steam as the humans dragged two wounded Xyrisians with them, Terk loyalists who'd refused the amnesty deal. One coughed blood onto Voss's armor, her breath ragged. "They're afraid," she wheezed. The magistrates promised no more purges if... Kess kicked open a rusted grate, her face a mask of fury. "So they trade lives for promises." The answer came hours later, in the smoking ruins of a rebel outpost. The magistrates hadn't kept their word. Jorel's faction hung from the battlements, their bodies twisting in the wind, proof that oppressors only bargain until they don't need to anymore. Voss stood in the shadow of the corpses, his hands clenched. Some lessons had to be written in blood. The real fight started now, not just against tyranny, but against the fear that let it fester. And for that, words wouldn't be enough. The weapons depot loomed like a steel fortress in the dead zone between districts, its perimeter lined with auto turrets that swiveled lazily in the toxic haze. Voss crouched behind a slag heap, the rebel scouts pressed close beside him, their breath shallow. They'd never seen human firearms up close, only heard whispers of their power. The time for whispers was over. Kess's fingers flew across a stolen security pad, her teeth bared in a grin as the depot's outer gates groaned open. 30 seconds, she hissed. The turrets wouldn't stay blind for long. Voss didn't waste words. He tossed a pulse grenade into the nearest guard tower and charged forward as the explosion painted the sky crimson. The depot's defenders barely had time to scream before human-grade plasma rifles tore through their ranks. Rebels surged from the shadows, their hands shaking not from fear now, but from the weight of weapons they'd only dreamed of wielding. One young Zyrisian fumbled with his rifle's charge setting until Voss gripped his wrist, adjusting his grip. "Fight like you mean it," the commander growled. The rebel's eyes locked onto his, then hardened. Something in that moment crystallized. This wasn't just about stealing guns, it was about stealing back the right to be feared. The ruling caste's response came too late. Reinforcements poured into the depot yard just as the rebels unleashed their first coordinated volley. Plasma fire turned the compound into a sunburst of blue-white annihilation. Armored vehicles vaporized mid-turn. Elite shock troops, bred for generations to believe themselves invincible, died screaming as their ceramite plating melted like wax. Terk fought like a man possessed, his stolen rifle blazing. Every shot was vengeance for a memory, his sister vanishing into a labor camp, his father's corpse left rotting in the square. But this time the boot wasn't pressing down. This time they were the avalanche. By dawn, the depot belonged to the rebellion. Smoke curled from its shattered husk as rebels staggered out, their arms laden with enough firepower to turn the tide of a dozen battles. Voss watched them pass, these broken people standing straighter now, their spines reforged in the heat of victory. The ruling caste would call it a raid. The rebels would call it a miracle. History would call it the moment Zyrus 9 remembered how to bleed its oppressors dry. The ruling caste's broadcast towers hummed with venom, their screens flooding every city with the same grainy footage: humans gunning down Zyrisian civilians, humans torching homes, humans laughing over piles of corpses. Never mind that the bodies were actors, the fires staged. Truth had never been the point. Fear was the weapon, and it cut deeper than plasma. Kess crouched in a gutted relay station, her fingers dancing across spliced wires as Terk scouts kept watch. The air reeked of ozone and desperation. "Almost there," she muttered, her eyes locked on the flickering screen of her handheld decoder. The ruling caste's encryption was strong, but they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd built their empire on lies, and lies always left cracks. The hijack hit like a thunderclap. One moment the propaganda loop droned on, the next every screen in the system flickered. And there was Kess, her face smeared with soot but her voice steady as a blade. "People of Zyrus 9, she began, and the words weren't just for the oppressed. They were for the magistrate's own soldiers, for the traders watching from orbiting freighters, for the galaxy that had looked away too long. You've been fed lies, here's the truth." The footage that followed needed no narration: labor camps, mass graves, the ruling caste's private feasts while their people starved. And then the kicker: uncut recordings of the magistrates themselves, smugly discussing how easily the humans could be framed. Chaos erupted faster than Kess expected. A militia unit defected on live comms, their commander ripping the magistrate's sigil from his chest. Dockworkers on a fueling station sabotaged a warship's engines. The system wasn't just watching now, it was awake. The magistrates scrambled to reclaim the airwaves, but the damage was done. Kess's final words looped on every stolen frequency: "We came in peace." But peace doesn't mean silence. Some revolutions are fought with bullets. This one was won with light, the unbearable glare of truth shining on rot. And in that light, the ruling caste's shadows had nowhere left to hide. The capital's skyline burned. From the outer districts to the magistrate's spire, the city was a patchwork of fire and shadow, the air thick with the stench of scorched metal and ionized plasma. Voss adjusted his helmet, the HUD flickering as it mapped the labyrinth of barricades ahead. Beside him, Terk cycled the chamber of his rifle with a practiced jerk of his wrist. Neither spoke. Some truths didn't need words. The first barricade crumpled like paper. Human breaching charges turned durasteel plating into shrapnel, and the rebel vanguard poured through the gap, howling not in anger, but in something far more dangerous: hope. The ruling caste shock troops faltered. They'd been trained to crush unarmed dissidents, not face a tide of forged steel and stolen fury. Kes led the charge through the arterial boulevard, her squad sweeping side streets with ruthless efficiency. Every corner held ambushes, every window a sniper's nest, but the rebels fought differently now. They weren't just throwing themselves at the enemy. They moved with precision, flanking maneuvers taught by human war manuals, improvised explosives rigged with alien ingenuity. A militia transport rolled around the bend, its turret spinning until a rebel teenager, her scales still gleaming with youth, slapped a magnetic charge onto its underbelly. The explosion sent a fireball curling into the dawn. Terk's voice crackled over the comms, ragged but triumphant. Spires in sight. The magistrate's last stronghold loomed ahead, its mirrored surface reflecting the chaos below. Something primal stirred in Voss's chest. Every revolution had this moment, the second when the impossible became inevitable. Then the sky split open. Reinforcements streaked down from orbit, gunships bristling with enough firepower to level districts. The rebels froze, even Terk's breath hitched. This wasn't part of the plan. Voss didn't hesitate. He wrenched open a rebel satchel, yanking out a signal beacon. All units, he barked into the calm. Light them up. A dozen flares shot into the smog-choked air, their phosphorescent trails painting targets across the gunship's hulls. The Harmony's voice roared back through the static. Targets acquired. The orbital strike came not as a single blow, but a symphony. Precision beams lanced from the heavens, shearing wings from gunships, turning armored columns into molten scrap. The rebels surged forward, their screams lost in the cacophony. Terk reached the spire's steps first, his claws leaving bloody streaks on the marble. Voss covered his advance, firing until his rifle's power cell ran dry. Somewhere in the chaos, Kes was laughing, her voice raw with adrenaline. They breached the doors not as liberators or conquerors, but as reckoning. The magistrates huddled in their throne room, their finery suddenly grotesque against the backdrop of collapse. The head magistrate rose, his voice trembling with the last vestiges of authority. "You don't understand what you've done," Terk's rifle barked once. The body hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Outside, the city held its breath. Then from the ruins, a sound the planet hadn't heard in centuries, cheering, not from a handful, not from a faction, from the streets, the rooftops, the shattered windows, a roar that shook the sky. Voss sank onto the steps, his hands shaking, not from exhaustion, from the weight of what they'd just unleashed. Revolutions weren't clean, they weren't kind. But in the ashes of the old world, something new was stirring, and for the first time in generations, it had a chance to breathe. The sky above Xyrus 9 split apart as the warship dagger of supremacy descended through the smoke, its ventral cannons glowing hellish orange. The city's defenders froze mid-charge, their faces upturned in horror. Everyone knew what those cannons meant: glassing. The ruling caste's final solution: erase the rebellion, the humans, the very ground they stood on, and salt the ashes. Kes's hands tightened on the Harmony's controls. The ship wasn't built for combat. Its hull groaned under stress fractures from earlier battles, its shields flickering at 15%. A sane pilot would have retreated, but as the dagger's cannons pulsed with gathering energy, sanity wasn't on the menu. "Commander," she said, her voice eerily calm over the comms, "I need a clean vector." Voss's reply was half protest, half plea, but she'd already input the course. The math was brutal, beautiful in its simplicity. No shields, no evasive maneuvers. Just speed, trajectory, and one very big explosion. The Harmony's engines screamed as she punched through the cloud layer. Alarms wailed, proximity alerts, structural integrity warnings, the ship's AI begging her to pull up. She silenced them all. The dagger's gunners spotted her too late. Plasma burst streaked past the cockpit, close enough to scorch the viewport, but Kes didn't flinch. Her fingers danced across the controls, nudging the ship's nose down half a degree. Precision mattered now. Kes, Terk's voice crackled through the static, raw with something between fury and grief. She almost smiled. No time for goodbyes, no time for anything but the click of her harness release and the 3 words she breathed into the mic before impact. Tell them we chose this. The harmony struck the dagger's engines like a knife to the spine. For 1 heartbeat, the warship hung motionless, its cannons still glowing. Then the chain reaction began, fuel lines detonating, antimatter containment failing, the colossal vessel listing sideways like a wounded beast. It crashed into the river delta instead of the city, the shockwave rippling outward in concentric rings of fire and steam. On the ground, Voss staggered to his knees as the heat washed over him. The rebellion should have died in that moment. Instead, the sky burned with sacrifice, and the roar that rose from the streets wasn't despair, it was a war cry. Kes had given them more than time. She'd given them a legend, and legends don't die when ships fall. They ignite. The magistrate's banners still smoldered in the ruins of the great square when Terk climbed the shattered steps of the propaganda stage, the same platform where rulers had once proclaimed their lies to cowed crowds. Now the air smelled of charred metal and something unfamiliar, possibility. His claws scraped against the cracked marble as he turned to face the sea of faces below. Zyrisians packed the square, their scales still streaked with ash and blood, their eyes wide with disbelief. For centuries, those eyes had known only fear. Now they burned. Terk didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The crowd hushed as if straining to catch the first notes of a melody long forgotten. Today, he said, the words raw and unpolished, we are free. No grand speech, no triumphant rhetoric, just 4 syllables that cracked the sky open. The roar that answered shook the ground, a sound like continents breaking apart, part cheer, part sob, part primal scream finally unleashed. Some in the crowd collapsed to their knees, their fingers digging into the soil as if to prove it was real. Others clutched their children, lifting them high so they'd remember this moment when history became something they lived instead of something done to them. Voss watched from the edges, his armor dented, his human frame suddenly insignificant against the tide of raw emotion. A Zyrisian elder limped toward him, her gnarled hands clutching a bundle of woven reeds, an offering. No, not an offering, a gift. The meaning was clear even without words. You could have left, you stayed. The ruling caste's surviving officials were dragged forward in chains, their once impeccable robes torn, their heads bowed. The crowd's fury surged like a living thing, but Terk raised a claw. No executions, he said, his voice cutting through the thunder. We bury the system, not the bodies. The silence that followed was heavier than any cry for vengeance could have been. Later, when the first new banners rose above the square, stitched together from scavenged cloth, their colors mismatched, but defiant Voss found himself flanked by rebels who didn't cheer or salute. They simply stood with him, their shoulders brushing his, as if to say, this is your place now, with us. The Harmony's surviving crew moved through the crowds like ghosts, their human faces drawing touches, whispered thanks, children's curious fingers tracing the strange smoothness of their skin. Kes would have loved this, Voss thought, then corrected himself. She was this. Every spark in the rebel's eyes, every unshackled step carried her forward. As dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, the first spontaneous song rose from the square, a Zyrisian hymn band for generations, its lyrics half-remembered but rising stronger with every voice that joined. The humans didn't know the words, but the melody needed no translation. Some victories couldn't be measured in territory taken or enemies felled. This one echoed in the spaces between breaths, in the lightness of hands no longer clenched for battle, in the impossible truth spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The war was over. The living began. The broadcast chamber aboard the Harmony's sole surviving shuttle was little more than a gutted comms array jury rigged for transmission, its flickering holofield casting phantom light across Commander Voss's battered armor. He adjusted the mic with fingers that still trembled from adrenaline, the weight of the moment pressing down like a collapsing star. This wasn't just a victory announcement. It was a declaration to the galaxy, one that would scorch its way across 1,000 oppressed worlds. The feed went live with a silent pulse, bypassing censors and embargoes to splash across every viewport from merchant freighters to Senate halls. Voss didn't bother with diplomatic wrappings. His voice, rough from smoke and shouting, carried the rasp of a man who'd seen hell and dragged his people back from the brink. The ruling caste of Xyrus 9 is broken, a pause deliberate, not by armies, not by treaties, by farmers who picked up tools, by children who remembered their parents' names. By the refusal to kneel. Behind him, the shuttle's cracked viewport framed the planet below. Its cities no longer smoldering ruins but pulsing with light, its skies clear of gunships for the first time in living memory. The contrast was the real message, not just liberation but transformation. Then came the words that would echo through history. Humanity didn't start this fire. We just reminded the galaxy what happens when you try to smother sparks. A beat. The next sentence landed like a fusion warhead. Wherever there are chains, we'll hear the rattle. Wherever there's silence, we'll listen harder, and when the oppressed rise, his smile was all teeth. We'll stand with them. The transmission cut abruptly, leaving only static and panic. On the oligarchic world of Zelthan Prime, a consortium of mining magnates watched the feed in a vaulted chamber, their jewels suddenly feeling less like adornments and more like targets. "They'll come for our labor camps next," hissed one, his frills flushing crimson. In the velvet darkness of a Senate cloister, a Tarkalan ambassador stared at his own trembling claws. His people had quashed 3 rebellions this cycle alone. Now, whispers of Xyrus 9 victory slithered through their slave quarters like wildfire. Even Earth's High Council blanched. Their carefully curated neutrality was ash in the wind. Voss had just rewritten humanity's role in the cosmos not as cautious mediators, but as the match thrown into the powder keg. The ripple had begun, and somewhere in the dark between stars, a dozen more sparks hissed to life. The great hall of justice, once the ruling caste's gilded theater of show trials, now hummed with a different energy, the low, seething murmur of a people who had waited lifetimes to speak. The surviving magistrates sat shackled in the defendant's dock, their scales dull without the oils and polishes of privilege, their eyes darting like trapped animals. The crowd packing the galleries didn't roar, they didn't need to. Their silence was heavier. Terk rose first, his claws leaving gouges in the wooden podium as he leaned forward. "This tribunal," he said, the words measured, "will not be their mirror." The implication hung sharp in the air. No forced confessions, no executions without testimony. Justice, even for monsters, would be the revolution's first act of defiance against the old order's cruelty. But justice is a fragile thing when generations of pain press against the courtroom doors. A young Xyrisian in the front row stood abruptly, her voice cracking. My sister mined crystal until her lungs failed. Where was her trial? The dam broke. Cries erupted, names of the dead, dates of massacres, the raw arithmetic of suffering. One magistrate, his once pristine robes frayed, dared to smirk. That was his mistake. The crowd surged like a tidal wave, benches toppling as hands reached for the dock. Voss moved without thinking. He planted himself between the mob and the magistrates, his arms spread wide, his uniform's insignia catching the light. Stop, a single word, but it carried the weight of every life lost to build this moment. You tear them apart now, you prove them right. The stillness that followed was deafening. A woman in the front row, her claws still extended, shuddered, then let her hands fall. Then make them see, she whispered, and so they did. The trials unfolded not in hours but days, every atrocity meticulously documented, every victim given a voice. Magistrates who'd once signed death warrants with a flourish now listened as survivors recited the names of those they'd erased. Some broke. One, an old warlord who'd personally overseen the purges, wept openly as a child described watching her parents dig their own graves. Voss watched from the shadows, his jaw tight. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about revelation, the unbearable light of truth forcing the galaxy to witness what happened when power went unchecked. When the final verdicts were read, even the loudest cries for blood had quieted. The magistrates would live, they would work, they would remember. As the guards led them away, Terk caught Voss's eye across the room. No words passed between them, none were needed. The revolution had won its first battle without firing a shot. And in that hall, heavy with the ghosts of the dead and the breath of the living, something unprecedented took root. The fragile, furious hope that justice could be more than vengeance in cleaner clothes. The rubble of the old regime hadn't even cooled when the first Provisional Council convened in the ruins of the magistrates' archive. Not a palace, not a fortress, just a shell of a building with its propaganda murals still peeling from the walls. Terk sat at the head of a table welded together from scrap metal, flanked by rebels, scholars, even a former slave who'd once mined the crystals powering their oppressors' weapons. And at his right hand, Commander Voss, not as a ruler, not as a liberator, but as the one person in the room who'd seen revolutions fail. "This isn't ours to build," Voss said, his palms flat on the table. The words weren't a disclaimer, they were a challenge. Around him, Zyrisians leaned in, their claws leaving marks in the wood. "You decide what comes next. But if you want it, we'll share what we've learned." He didn't mean tactics, didn't mean weapons. He meant the quiet, brutal calculus of freedom. How to balance mercy with survival, how to dismantle an empire without becoming its echo. The debates that followed scorched through the nights. A labor rep demanded immediate seizure of the ruling caste's factories. A historian warned against erasing all records of the old regime. "They're monsters," she admitted, "but monsters teach us what not to become." Through it all, the humans listened more than they spoke. Kess's old hacking rig became the provisional government's nervous system, rerouting power grids, restoring water lines, tools for stability, not control. Then came the announcement that sent shockwaves through the system. Projected onto the skeletal remains of the orbital defense grid, Terk's face flickered over every surviving screen. In 90 days, he declared, this planet will vote, not for representatives chosen by bloodline or wealth, but for voices drawn from the mines, the fields, the ruins where the dispossessed had whispered their dreams for generations. The date wasn't arbitrary. It gave them time to do what no conqueror in Zyrus 9 history had ever attempted: teach a people how to govern themselves. Voss found the first voter registration station by accident, tucked into the hollowed-out husk of a detention center. The line stretched for blocks, former prisoners holding scraps of salvaged metal as proof of residence, their hands shaking not from fear but from something far more dangerous: ownership. A child tugged his sleeve, her eyes wide. "Are you really from the stars?" He crouched, his knee popping. "Yeah, and so are you." The ruling caste's last allies screamed from their exile fleets that this was madness. That order required hierarchy, that giving power to the broken would only breed chaos, but chaos had a different face on Zyrus 9 now. It looked like a farmer arguing zoning laws in a reclaimed assembly hall. It smelled like the ink of freshly printed ballots. It sounded like Terk roaring with laughter when a factory worker corrected his economic policy mid-speech. On the eve of the elections, Voss stood under a sky free of gun platforms for the first time in centuries, the Harmony's survivors beside him. They'd sworn not to interfere. But as the first polls opened, as the line swelled with generations of people who'd never been asked their opinion before, he allowed himself one quiet act of rebellion. He reached into his pocket and pressed a single data chip into Terk's palm. Every human constitution, every charter of rights, every flawed, glorious attempt at self-rule from Earth's blood-stained history. Not instructions, he murmured, just possibilities. Terk weighed the chip in his hand, his claws catching the dawn light. Then he grinned, all teeth. We'll make our own. The memorial wasn't built from marble or polished metal, but from the wreckage of the Harmony's cockpit, its twisted frame rising like a skeletal hand from the center of the newly renamed Kess Plaza. They could have melted it down, could have buried it with military honors, but the rebels insisted on this, a monument that bore the scars of her final moments, standing raw and unvarnished under Xyrus 9's pale sun. Voss stood before it, his fingers brushing the scorched edges where Kess's controls had fused under impact. The crowd behind him, rebels, Harmony crew, civilians who'd never met her but knew her name like a prayer, held their breath as he spoke. She gave everything, he said, the words cracking under the weight of all they carried, not just for the revolution, not just for them, for the idea that some lights burn too bright to be extinguished, even when the ship carrying them falls. A child hardly older than 6, her scales still soft with youth, stepped forward, clutching a fistful of glowing moss from the underground tunnels where the rebellion had once hidden. She pressed it into the jagged metal, and like a signal, others followed. Offerings piled up, a sniper's spent cartridge, a scribbled note with coordinates only Kess would have recognized. A single pilot's insignia pried from the uniform of a rebel who died in the Spire assault. The memorial grew not as a tomb but as a living thing fed by memory. Terk didn't give a speech, he didn't need to. When the city's newly elected council unveiled the street sign bearing Kess's name in both Xyrisian glyphs and human script, he simply lifted a plasma torch and welded it to the post himself, the sparks falling like stars at his feet. The message was clear. This wasn't just gratitude, it was kinship forged in fire. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the first night winds stirred the offerings left at the memorial's base, Voss found a single, unexpected addition, a child's drawing tucked between 2 shards of wreckage. It showed a stick-figure human with wild hair standing atop a pile of broken chains, her arms outstretched. No words, just a title scrawled in wobbly letters at the top, the Sky Woman. Some heroes get statues. Kess got something better, a legacy that walked in the footsteps of free children, whispering her name on streets she'd never see. The first reports trickled in like stray sparks landing on dry tinder. A riot on Zelthan Prime's loading docks, a weapons cache looted from a Tarkilan garrison, a mining colony on the fringe where overseers woke to find their shock collars disabled and their slaves gone. The footage was grainy, smuggled out via spliced comms relays, but the message was crystal clear. Xyrus 9 fire had jumped containment. Terk found Voss on the Harmony's observation deck, watching the planet below through the viewport. "You realize what you've done." The rebel leader's voice was rough, but his claws tapped an arrhythmic beat against the bulkhead, not fear, anticipation. That's 3 systems in as many weeks. The magistrate's allies are locking down their own cities now, afraid their people will get ideas. Voss didn't turn. The scars on his knuckles ached from where he'd split them open on a magistrate's jaw weeks ago. "Funny thing about ideas," he murmured. "They don't need ships to travel." Below them, the planet spun, its night side dotted with new lights where rebuilt cities throbbed with life. The ruling caste's response was predictable. Emergency decrees, propaganda blasts painting the revolution as a human plague. Warships diverted from border skirmishes to patrol restless colonies. But every screen they seized, every transmitter they smashed, only fed the myth growing in the dark. If a backwater like Xyrus 9 could break its chains, who said they had to be exceptions? A Tarkilan laborer, her carapace still streaked with ore dust, broadcast from a stolen freighter's cockpit. "We are not one, we are many." The footage shook as her ship punched through a blockade, her voice rising over the alarms. "And we are watching." By the time the Zelthan insurrection reached its peak, entire districts bathed in the orange glow of overturned refinery tanks. Even the most entrenched oligarchs panicked. Their private armies mutinied. Their trade partners demanded stability guarantees. The illusion of invincibility, carefully cultivated over centuries, dissolved like sugar in boiling water. Terk handed Voss a data slate with updated casualty reports, his expression unreadable. "This won't end with Xyrus 9. Voss finally turned from the viewport, the ghost of Kess's grin haunting his own. It wasn't supposed to. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a dozen more signals flickered to life. Not coordinated, not yet, but the rhythm was there, a heartbeat growing louder with every falling tyrant. The magistrates had built an empire on silence. Now the universe was learning to scream. The first orbital strike hit the agricultural sector at dawn, turning fields that had just begun to yield free harvests into glassy craters. The second struck a hospital flagged with rebel markings, its medics still pulling survivors from the rubble when the third bombardment began. The ruling caste's allies weren't just attacking Xyrus 9. They were erasing it methodically, block by block, their warships hanging in the sky like vultures waiting for the last twitch of a dying beast. Terk's claws sank into the command table hard enough to crack the display. "They're not just punishing us," he snarled, "they're making an example." The holomap flickered with fresh damage reports, entire districts blinking red as the bombardment rolled onward. Voss barely glanced at the devastation. His eyes locked onto the tactical readout, tracing the enemy fleet's formation with a predator's focus. "Fear only works if we let it," he said, his voice a blade dragged across stone. He tapped a cluster of rebel fighters, barely more than retrofitted freighters hovering at the edge of the system. "They think this is over because they dropped a few bombs. Time to remind them what happens when you kick a hive." The counteroffensive began not with a grand charge but with whispers. Sabotage teams slipped into the bombardment fleet supply lines, their tools laced with human-designed malware that turned fuel synthesizers into bombs. Dockworkers on Allied worlds accidentally misrouted ammunition shipments to rebel-held moons. And then the masterstroke, a coded pulse broadcast from the ruins of the Harmony's wreckage, triggered every hijacked comms tower in the sector simultaneously. Not a distress call, not a plea for mercy, a single phrase repeated in 100 languages across 1,000 screens. "You can't kill a shadow," the enemy fleet reeled. Drones meant to scout rebel positions suddenly veered into their own carriers. Navigation systems glitched, sending warships spiraling into each other's firing solutions. And through the chaos, the rebels struck not at the capital ships, but at the fragile tendrils of logistics holding the armada together. Supply depots erupted in silent flashes. Fuel barges drifted empty, their tanks slit open by boarding parties who left no survivors. Voss watched from the command hub, his hands steady on the console as Terk's face twisted into something feral. "They wanted to break us," the rebel leader hissed. Behind him, the holodisplay painted the system in streaks of crimson and gold enemy retreat vectors, blossoming like wounds across the stars. Instead, they just proved how scared they really are. Some victories aren't measured in territory taken. Sometimes the win is simply this: watching tyrants learn too late that the fear they tried to wield has a taste. And it's bitter on their tongues. The halls of Earth's Grand Senate echoed with a kind of quiet chaos, the rustle of data slates, the murmur of hushed arguments, the occasional sharp crack of a fist against polished wood. On the central holodisplay, Xyrus 9 burned, its newly freed cities cratered by orbital strikes, its skies choked with debris. Senator Elias Cho, his ceremonial robes rumpled from sleepless nights, stood at the podium, his voice cutting through the tension like a vibroblade. "History is watching," he said, the words reverberating through the chamber. "Not just us, our children, our grandchildren. They will ask what we did when the galaxy's scales tipped." At first, the debate had been predictable: condemnation, disavowals. The High Council's initial statement had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion, regrettable overreach, unsanctioned intervention, all the usual phrases meant to distance Earth from the wildfire spreading across the stars. But then the images started circulating, footage of Zyrisian children digging mass graves for their parents, testimony from freed slaves who'd carved human insignias into their own flesh as talismans. Public sentiment, once carefully curated by state media, boiled over. Protests erupted on Mars-terraced cities. Dockworkers on Luna refused to load supply ships bound for Allied regimes, and most damning of all, a coalition of retired admirals published an open letter. "We swore oaths to defend liberty," it read, "not to polish the boots of tyrants." The Senate's hand was forced. Reinforcements departed Earth's orbit not with fanfare but with grim determination. Not the gleaming battleships of parade reviews, but retrofitted freighters and aging cruisers, their hulls still scarred from border skirmishes. Their orders were a masterpiece of political compromise: provide humanitarian aid. Defend civilian zones, do not engage unless fired upon. The unspoken truth hung heavier than any official directive. Every gunner on those ships knew the real mission. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. And as the fleet translated into hyperspace, one question burned hotter than the engines: would they arrive as peacekeepers, or as the spark that lit 1,000 more revolutions? The void above Zyris 9 became a storm of fire and metal as the combined fleets collided: human cruisers flying rebel colors, their hulls still pockmarked from previous battles, surging forward alongside retrofitted Zyrisian freighters turned gunships. The ruling caste's armada loomed like a wall of polished steel, their flagship's ion cannons glowing ominously as they prepared to deliver the killing blow to the planet below. But this time, the rebels weren't hiding in tunnels or scrambling for scraps. This time, they met tyranny head-on. Voss's voice crackled across every open channel, stripped of diplomacy, raw with something older, the kind of fury that forged empires and toppled them. "For Kess," he roared, and the words weren't just a battle cry. They were a promise. The Harmony's surviving shuttle, its wings patched with scavenged plating, streaked into the fray like a dagger, drawing fire while Terk's ragtag fleet flanked the enemy's formation. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an unraveling. Human ECM systems turned the Armada's precision volleys into wild, unfocused sprays of energy, their targeting arrays scrambled by waves of interference. Rebel saboteurs aboard Allied supply ships detonated their cargo holds, sending chain reactions rippling through the enemy's rear lines, and then the killing stroke. A suicidal run by a Zyrisian pilot, her ship loaded with enough stolen antimatter to crack a moon, ramming straight into the flagship's bridge. The explosion lit up the system, a second sun blooming for one terrible, beautiful moment. Panic spread through the enemy ranks like a virus. Ships that had never retreated in living memory spun on their axes, their commanders suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. The remaining loyalists fought with the desperate frenzy of cornered animals, but the tide had turned. By the time the last enemy cruiser limped into hyperspace, the silence over the comms was deafening. Not the silence of shock, but of something heavier awareness. They'd done the impossible, and as Voss watched the debris field drift across Zyris 9 orbit, reflecting the light of its sun like 1,000 broken mirrors, he understood the real cost. This wasn't just victory, it was a beacon, and beacons once lit don't fade easily. The first rays of dawn over Zyris 9 capital didn't just illuminate the rubble. They painted the makeshift banners strung between broken towers, each one stitched from scraps of old uniforms and propaganda posters, now bearing the coalition's sigil, a clenched fist cradling a star. The air still carried the metallic tang of recent fires, but the silence had changed. No more distant artillery, no screams, just the quiet hum of reconstruction crews and the occasional cheer as another collapsed sector was cleared. Terk stood at the center of the grand concourse once the ruling caste's parade ground, his scales dull with exhaustion, but his spine rigid as he addressed the gathered representatives. Not just Zyrisians, faces from a dozen liberated systems filled the plaza. Zelthan miners in patched exosuits, Tarkalan laborers with their carapaces still bearing the marks of shock collars, even a handful of defected magistrates' officers who'd traded their insignias for the simple grey armbands of the penitent. The coalition wasn't just an alliance, it was a reckoning. "We won't forget who stood with us," Terk said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Then he turned, gripping Voss's forearm in the old Zyrisian gesture of blood brotherhood, his claws pressing just hard enough to leave faint marks. The significance wasn't lost on anyone. The humans weren't being thanked as meddlers or even allies. They were being claimed as kin. Voss's response was swallowed by the roar that followed, a sound that shook the glassless windows of the surrounding ruins. Behind him, the surviving Harmony crew stood in mismatched uniforms, their faces streaked with soot and something softer disbelief, maybe, that they'd lived to see this. The coalition's first act wasn't a treaty or a victory parade. It was something far more subversive. They tore up the old star charts, no more client worlds. No more tributary systems. The new maps projected above the plaza in flickering holograms showed something radical, a network of equals. Each planet's name appeared in its native script first, followed by phonetic translations. A small thing, a monumental thing. As the crowd dispersed, rebels turned civil engineers, soldiers turned teachers. Voss found himself staring at a mural freshly painted on a half-collapsed wall. It depicted the Harmony's final plunge, yes, but not as destruction. As a bridge, its wreckage arcing between stars, connecting worlds that had never dared to speak before. Terk joined him, following his gaze. "They'll come for us again," he murmured, not with fear, but with the grim certainty of a man who'd learned the price of hope. Voss smiled, slow and sharp. "Let them." Somewhere overhead, the coalition's first joint fleet glinted in the sunlight, its hull still scarred, its guns silent for now. Not a shield, not a sword, a promise. The plaza was quiet when they unveiled the first monument, not the tense silence of fear, but the deep, reverent hush of memory taking physical form. The structure wasn't carved from marble or forged from steel. It was built from the wreckage of battleships and the shattered remnants of shock collars, melted down and reshaped into a spire that arched toward the sky like a fist uncurling. At its base, names glowed in a dozen languages, each etched by hand into the metal. Not just soldiers, not just rebels, the cook who'd smuggled bombs in flour sacks. The child who'd died carrying water to the barricades, every life that had tipped the scales. Voss stood before the crowd, his uniform crisp for once, the scars on his knuckles pale against his clasped hands. "They died for something greater," he said, the words simple, unadorned, not a eulogy, a fact, the kind that sinks into bones and stays. Around him, representatives from 100 worlds, some in silks, some in patched armor, listened without breathing. A Zelthan miner, her exosuit still streaked with ore dust, reached out to trace a name at random. Her fingertip left a smudge on the metal. Later, no one would clean it off. The monuments multiplied like echoes. In the asteroid belts where pirates had once ruled, a hollowed-out freighter became a floating garden, its hull seeded with flowers from every coalition world. On Tarkella, where dissent had been punishable by public incineration, the execution grounds were paved over with glass beneath it, the ashes of the fallen preserved forever, illuminated from below so they shimmered like constellations. Even Earth, so hesitant at first, erected a pillar in the Grand Senate courtyard. Its inscription was a single line: "We looked away until we couldn't." But the most haunting memorial was the one no one had planned. In the slums of Zyrus' 9 outer districts, where the ruling caste had once herded the unfit, children began leaving offerings at the sites of old barricades, toys mostly. Cracked datapads with stories of the revolution scrawled in crayon. a rusted knife with a handle wrapped in someone's hair. They called it the remembering game, though no adult could say who'd started it. One day, Turk found a scrap of cloth tied to a broken turret, its edges frayed. When he unfolded it, he recognized Kess's flight insignia, the fabric stiff with old blood. The child who'd left it was long gone. Voss found him there at dusk, clutching the scrap like a talisman. They didn't speak. The wind carried the distant sound of singing from a rebuilt schoolhouse, a melody too buoyant for morning. That was the legacy, wasn't it? Not just stone and metal, but the quiet certainty that some fires, once lit, refused to go out. Behind them, the first stars of evening winked to life, indifferent to the scars below. Or maybe not indifferent, maybe just waiting to see what they'd do next. The landing bay smelled of scorched metal and fresh paint, the scent of endings and beginnings tangled together. The Harmony's surviving crew moved through their final checks in near silence, their hands lingering on consoles they'd rebuilt from scrap, their eyes darting to the viewports where Zyrisian's friends now, not strangers, stood watching. Turk leaned against the gangway railing, his claws tapping an idle rhythm against the metal. He'd never been one for speeches. The goodbye, when it came, was characteristically blunt. "You'll always have a home here," he said, jerking his chin toward the city beyond the bay. Not the ruins they'd fought through, but the new skyline rising from them, its scaffolds alive with workers singing as they welded. The offer wasn't ceremonial. It was etched in the same unshakable certainty as his battle plans: no conditions, no caveats, just a door left permanently open. Voss didn't reach for a handshake. He clasped Turk's forearm instead, the old rebel scales rough under his fingers. "And you'll always have allies in us." The words carried weight beyond the moment, not a promise of fleets or treaties, but something fiercer, the unspoken vow that if the call came, they'd answer. No questions asked, the engines roared to life, drowning out whatever might have been said next. As the Harmony lifted off, its patched hull glittering in the sunlight, the crowd below didn't wave. They raised their fists, rebels, former slaves, even a few reformed magistrates, their voices rising in a ragged cheer that followed the ship into the sky. Inside the cockpit, the comms crackled with one last transmission, raw with static and something else. A child's voice, high and clear: "Tell the stars we're coming." Voss exhaled, his fingers tightening around the controls. The mission log would officially list this as a return trip, but the ship humming around him, its every weld and jury-rigged system bearing the marks of Zyrus' 9 hands, told a different story. They weren't just going home, they were carrying a spark now, and sparks, once lit, had a way of spreading. The Harmony's engines hummed a steady rhythm as the stars blurred past the viewports, the quiet of deep space pressing against the hull like a held breath. Voss sat in the dim glow of the command console, his fingers tracing the edges of a data chip, the last transmission from Zyrus 9. Then the alert flashed. A priority signal, scrambled and tight, beamed from a relay station on the fringe of human space. No sender ID, just 7 words that turned the air to ice. "The ruling caste's allies are regrouping." This isn't over. The crew gathered around the holodisplay, their faces etched with a tension that had become familiar. Lieutenant Chen broke the silence first, her voice tight. "They're not just licking their wounds, they're reorganizing." Across from her, Engineer Rourke cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the stillness. "And we're down to half our munitions and a prayer." Voss didn't move. His reflection in the viewport showed a man older than the one who'd left Earth, his stubble flecked with gray, his eyes sharp as broken glass. But when he turned to them, his voice carried no hesitation. "Then neither are we." The words weren't just defiance, they were a pivot. The Harmony wasn't a warship, but it carried something far more dangerous: witnesses. Survivors, proof of what happened when the oppressed stopped begging and started fighting. Rourke exhaled sharply, his grimace twisting into something fiercer. "So what's the play? Run home and scream for reinforcements?" Voss tapped the star chart, zooming in on a cluster of unaligned systems neutral territory, at least on paper. "We don't scream, we show." The holograph flickered, highlighting a derelict comms hub, its transmitters powerful enough to punch a signal across half the galaxy. Every vid from Xyrus 9, every testimony, let the universe see what regrouping really looks like. Chen's brow furrowed. And if Earth grounds us, if the Senate tries to muzzle this? This time it wasn't Voss who answered. Ensign Kova, the youngest of them, straightened in her seat, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Then we leak it. Dock by dock, port by port, they can't silence a ghost." The ship's AI chimed softly, calculating the jump to the hub. 73 hours, just long enough to edit the footage, to stitch the raw horror of Xyrus 9 into something that couldn't be ignored. Voss switched off the holodisplay, the darkness settling over them like armor. Some fights weren't won with guns, they were won with light, the kind that made shadows recoil. Outside, the stars wheeled on, indifferent, but aboard the Harmony, the quiet had changed. No longer the hush of exhaustion, the quiet of a blade being sharpened. The Harmony's battered hull cut through Earth's atmosphere like a returning ghost, its scorched plating catching the sunlight in flickers of gold and black. The landing pads below bristled with crowds, politicians in formal robes, military brass with polished insignias, but also dockworkers in grease-stained coveralls and students clutching handmade banners. They'd all come for the same reason, to witness the reckoning. Voss stepped onto the tarmac, the weight of alien suns still clinging to his shoulders. The air smelled of rain and engine fuel, achingly familiar after so long away. A delegation of high counselors approached, their expressions tight with the kind of strained diplomacy reserved for loose cannons. "Commander," the lead envoy began, her voice slick as oil, "your unorthodox actions have raised concerns." He didn't wait for the rehearsed speech. Turning to the gathered crowds, he raised his voice above the murmur. "They told us our mission was peace." The words weren't amplified, but they carried, heads tilted, phones lifted. But peace isn't passive, it isn't silence while others suffer. A ripple went through the crowd, some stiffening, others leaning forward. Sometimes revolution is the only way. The backlash was immediate. Counselors sputtered about jurisdiction, about destabilization. But the roar from the docks drowned them out. A group of Martian freighters, their hulls plastered with Xyrisian solidarity slogans, unleashed a deafening horn blast. A veteran in the front row, her uniform jacket studded with old campaign pins, snapped a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. The real impact, though, wasn't in the plaza. It was in the flickering feed streaming Voss's words to every settled world, in the Tarkalan labor tunnels where whispered translations passed mouth to ear, in the Zelthan shipyards where workers exchanged glances over half-disabled shock collars. The message wasn't just heard, it was repeated, as security escorted Voss away ostensibly for debriefing. Though everyone knew it was containment, a child darted past the barricades. She thrust a folded paper into his hand. Unfolding it revealed a crude drawing, the Harmony soaring above a crowd of stick-figure aliens, their arms raised. No words, just a title scrawled at the top, "The Ship That Broke the Dark." Somewhere in the cosmos, a dozen more sparks hissed to life.